recording. All right. So, I'm sorry that there was not a lengthy explanation of the assignment up on Canvas. There's now, right? And that means that the revision can wipe out the draft grade. Does that make, because, right? And almost all your comments said that, right? Those of you who got your comments back, right? One of the things it said is that to do a good revision, and this doesn't matter, right? So I want to go over the thematic essay final project in detail, and I also want to sort of talk about some of the pragmatics, the nuts and bolts of getting the paper together, right? And also talk a little bit about citations, right, and how to do footnotes and whatnot. Even though you can still do MLA in text citations if you want to, but we'll talk more about that, right? So I'd rather that you gave me a good paper with MLA citations than a crappy paper with Chicago citations, if that's the choice you have to make, right? Paper's not due until the last day of class, right? The 10th. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yes, it's Friday the 10th, so you have all of test week to put it together.
You mean, so the last day of finals is
That's what I mean. That's the last day of class.
No, last day of class
Is next Friday. Okay, well, no, because we have a class on finals week as well. So I would like you to get it to me before we have class, and that way you can enjoy class a little bit more, right? Since we're going to do a little potluck in our last day of class, we're just going to sort of chill for a bit and look at pictures, maybe talk about who did the best presentation while we were in Amsterdam, sort of stuff, right? Sydney. What time should we come when? Where?
The finals.
I don't know. What does it say? The final is like on. It's at 3, I think, isn't it? 3 to 5:30, right? So you should come at 3.
Wait, isn't that when the presentations begin as well? Yeah, presentations.
Yeah, well, they're not going to do a lot of. This is going to be very informal.
Oh, okay.
Very, very informal.
Right.
Right. What did I say? Are we guys supposed to be doing formal presentations? I don't think I asked you to do formal
I
presentations.
don't think it's
No, the paper is the be all and end all, right? Because if you're just finishing up your paper at 1 o'clock, then I don't expect you to turn around and make a presentation at 3, right? So you're good without a presentation. I may ask you, may ask each of you to sort of talk a little bit about what you did.
Yeah, that's
That. But I mean, it's not presentations. It's just sort of, hey, I thought this was really cool.
Or maybe just to talk about the paper.
Or you can talk about anything you want. You can talk about what you would do differently if you had it to do again.
Yeah.
Right? So, it's going to be very informal. It will not impact your grade at all. However, not coming will impact your grade, right? Because you need to be here for that. Okay, so don't just blow it off. Okay, so I've got up here we're going to look at the, under thematic essays. You've all got comments back. I made extensive comments on everybody's, like a lot, right? Not only I'll give you a second, Shelley. Let me finish this idea, otherwise I'll lose it. And there it went. No, most of you got like an idea about how to focus the paper better, an outline, as well as other sources that you might think about looking into. Almost everybody got that, right? So make sure that you heed suggestions that you've been given. Insofar as the outline, that's more of a suggestion, right? But if I've said, hey, you really need to find out more about it by looking over here, then I suggest that you look over there, right? The other thing is, I'm thinking of you, young lady, is that there are some sources out there that aren't in English that you might be interested in finding. So Jesse, for example, is working on Jan Asselin, and the only book that's only on Jan Asselin is in German, right? But Jesse probably didn't realize that her college professor can read German, and with not great ease, but can try. Right, and is happy to sort of read, here's where they're saying, and this is kind of the gist of what they're saying, right? So if you've got something that you found that's in a language that you don't fully understand, you can ask me if I sit down with you and go over it a little bit and sort of talk about it, right? Sure.
I haven't gotten
I said it last night. Okay. No. Yours was done 2 days ago, so I'm really sorry. That's 2 days lost, though. I will send you yours then, because everybody that sent me one got it back, right? As of this morning, I got the last ones that came in late, got back to people this morning. So yours, I know I did, and I know I've got comments. So thank you for letting me know. I've got it written down right here. As soon as class is over, I will email you yours. I won't do it in front of everybody. Nice of me that way, right? Especially because it says, "Holy crap, what's this junk?" No, I'm kidding. It doesn't. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Okay. So on the page for the thematic essay project, there's some things that you should pay attention to that are really important for putting together the final thing. Chicago-style format guidelines, which you've seen before, right? How to format the bibliography and the footnotes. We'll talk a little bit more about that today. The extended essay instructions and template is a narrative explanation of all of the paper requirements in text form. You can just read it. The other thing is that it's a template you can use where you can replace my text with yours, and all of a sudden all the formatting's taken care of for you. Nice, right? So problematic things like how do you get the page numbering to start on page 2 versus page 1? It's already solved if you use the template, right? And a little guideline on when and where and how to use direct quotes that I would recommend that everybody reads, right? The bottom line is, don't. I mean, that's most of your direct quotes you don't need. I would say 90% of the direct quotes that students use, they do not need to be direct quotes, right? And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go over the extended instructions and template. We look at that, okay? Direct quotes, every direct quote ought to be evidence that you're using to support something you're saying, not just an excuse for not writing that sentence yourself, right? And that's why I say 90% of the people who do just go into somebody else's voice because they think it makes them look smarter, and it doesn't, right? So, don't. Okay. So, like I said, my apologies for not having that up there earlier. The thematic essay link, it's here now as a PDF. I've got it here already open as a Word document, so we can go back to this more easily. Right? So, make this just a little bit bigger so we can see it. Is that good for everybody? Yeah? Do we need to dim the lights more? Are we cool with this? Yeah? Okay, cool.
Actually, let me turn off the light. It'll be easier.
Would make it easier for you? Thank you. Make it harder for me to see my notes. But there we are. Great. Okay, good. So, right, most of you have already done this first part, which is to research the theme related to your work. You've determined a theme with me. We sat down and talked about it, right? Research the theme related to your work by comparing it to other works that also treat the theme. Again, came up with a list with that, and I gave you recommendations on that. And by researching scholarly sources on your work, on the comparative works, as well as for some of you, not all of you, but for some of you, other primary and secondary sources that relate to your theme. Right, so this is a bigger thing, I think, for Olivia, who's not here, and Maeve, who's dealing with sort of things that might relate to literature. That's the idea of primary and secondary sources outside of art might come into play more strongly for them than it might for others. Okay, research. Use your research to develop a 6-page essay that discusses your theme in depth. Use the comparative works as primary sources to help you understand your work and your theme better. But try to keep the focus on how you understand the theme in your work of art. Right? It shouldn't just be a broad overview of how it plays out and everything else. We're trying to use all that evidence to come to some deeper understanding. Right? So you shouldn't feel that if you've got 6 works of art that every one of them is going to get a page. You know what I mean? All the other works of art are evidence that help us understand what's going on with your work better. Right? So think about the other works of art as evidence to support a point about your picture. That point that we talked about when we sat down in my office. Right? What's the artist done that is conventional versus innovative? What impact does that have on your painting's meaning or your understanding of the painting? When you do your research and you write your paper, don't try to convey everything you've learned in the course of your research. When I was where you are, right, sitting there, before we had one of these, or even one of these, right, I had handwritten notes on yellow pieces of paper. And you know what I did is I cut them all up and I put them on the floor in an order that made some sense. That's a dumbass way to work, right? Because it ended up being a cobbling together of just a bunch of random ideas. I still got an A, but I probably shouldn't have, you know? So think about the writing as a way of focusing your thoughts, right? What do you really want to talk about here? And what you're going to find in doing research is that a lot of the research that you do, 50% of what you do as a researcher, doesn't end up in the final paper, but rather gives you the confidence to say what you need to say in the final paper, that gives you the authority that puts you on a plane to say, I've got something to say about this, right? And doesn't necessarily mean that just because you did that research, you got nothing out of it, right? Because the whole point of this class for all of you in this room, except for Dina and Madeline, who's a minor, is that you're here to expand your knowledge. You're here to learn something that you don't normally take classes in, right? And if that's the point of the class, then the research that doesn't fit into the paper is part of that, isn't it? Right? It's part of what college is kind of all about, which is exploring, finding out things. Right? College isn't about writing papers. College is about adding to your knowledge, right? So don't think that everything has to fit in your paper, and don't think that everything, that if it doesn't, it was a waste of time, because it wasn't, right? It gives you that authority, it gives you that knowledge that you need, right? Be sure to try to work the paper through more drafts than just the one that you did. More times that you rework it, reread it, look at the wording. Think about consolidating. Think about paring it down. Are you using 10 words where 5 will work just fine? Do reverse outlines, right? Go through it and write in the margin of each and every one of them, what is this paragraph about? And if you can't tell me in 3 words, maybe 5, then that paragraph should be 2 paragraphs. And if it's way too short, that means you haven't presented your evidence fully, right? You've made a conclusion. You've told me something that you think about something, but you haven't really presented why you think that, right? So, right, the more times that you can work through drafts, the better it will be, okay? And that's true even between the drafts. Clearly articulate your ideas. Fully and thoughtfully consider your ideas. Think about organization and flow. Think about spelling, grammar, and syntax. I'm trying to get better at this. My emails are so sucky, aren't they? I mean, they're really bad. There's like always a letter missing somewhere because I'm trying to get it out as fast as I can so I can get on to other things. And I just look, I got the little 20-second delay thing, and I was doing undo, right? Because there's something in there that doesn't belong. But, before you turn it in, just run a spell check, right? And it's hard because you got all these Dutch names that it's not going to recognize. But, Shelley can add Haida to her dictionary. And that means every time she types up something for another class, she has to write head, and she misspells it, she's going to be in trouble. Right? It's going to show up as a properly spelled word in your other things. You can remove it from your dictionary too, right? Stick in words that are are going to come up a lot. Okay, but do make sure you take some time with spelling, grammar, and syntax. My colleagues in the English department don't care that much about it. I kind of do. I think it really does. And I think you should as well, not just because I'm anal retentive. But I do think that our ability to present ourselves professionally affects the way people think about us. And if you leave here and you've got a job application and you need to turn in a cover letter and it's just full of grammar and syntax errors, they're not going to want to hire you, right? So think about this as practice, if nothing else, right? Okay, we've gotten through the draft already, rough draft, blah, 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 blah. The revision. Revision of the draft, considering my editorial comments and incorporating changes wherever necessary. These changes are expected to expand your essay to 6 pages. It should be the full 6 pages. It can go longer, that's fine. If you're up around 12, that means you maybe are lacking focus somewhere, right? There's probably a way in which I mentioned before, you're using 10 words when 5 would do, right? But I'm thinking that for most of you, you can get this in 6 to 8 pages just fine, right? If it's less than 6 pages, one of the things I would highly recommend doing is looking at whether or not you are making a claim that you are presenting no evidence for. Just a conclusion. This is the way it is, right? And if it's the way it is because someone else said it, right? Represent their evidence in an abbreviated form. How did they reach that conclusion, right? Okay, so 6 pages should do it. For me, I would need 20, but that's just me because this, long-winded, right? Okay. Most of you really do need to do a lot more work on the revision. I would say most, right, of you, and I mentioned ways in which to do this, right? Be careful about plagiarism. I didn't see any problems in the first set of drafts this way. Intro students always have a different issue, right? But just remember, don't block and copy things. When you're paraphrasing another author, don't just change one verb. Rethink the structure of the sentence. What are they trying to say, and how can you say it in 5 words or fewer? Right? I'm pointing at Margaret, she's in the front row. Right? But right, don't just say, oh, they said around, and so I'll say over and above, or something like that, right? And therefore I'm not plagiarizing. Make sure that you footnote any ideas that are not your own. You don't need to footnote general knowledge, right? Your painting is dated 1651, and everybody says it, and it's on the painting. You don't need to footnote where you read it as well, right? Jan Asseling was born in 1625, and I don't know when he was born, but if everybody says it, you don't need to footnote it, right? However, if it looks like it's the result of someone's research, right? If it looks like it's a contended issue, if it looks like an interpretation rather than a fact, which most of your research will be, then you should footnote those ideas. In the humanities, that's what we're footnoting. We're footnoting ideas, right? We're footnoting the results of other people's research, because in the humanities, we stand on their shoulders. That's kind of how the humanities works, right? Most sciences work that way as well. We build on what other people have done, and we want to acknowledge our debt to those people, right? So make sure that you got that. Okay? Questions so far? Longer overview, helpful, hopefully? Okay, very good. There's a checklist on the second page. Make sure you've got a cover sheet, right? That template has all of this. 6 full pages of double-spaced text, right? This does not include the cover sheet. This does not include the illustrations. Don't embed the illustrations in the, what, did I say something funny? Don't embed the illustrations in the text, right? Put them at the end. That way I know I don't have to run a word count, right? Doesn't count the works cited. Don't pad it with a huge font, wide margins, or extra spaces between paragraphs. People do that all the time.
I know it is. That's why it's funny that
because you've done it before.
I've never done it, but I know people have done it. They'll blow up the font size 30 and be met the page count.
Right. 2-inch margins all around. That makes it very easy. I've got a 5-word essay, and it's 6 pages long. No, it's obvious when this happens. And the extra space between the paragraphs, some word processing programs do that automatically. And I'm not going to get all over your case about it, but honestly, don't let your software control you. That's the wrong way around. You control your software, right? And it's very easy to change those presets, right? Anyway, okay, so yeah, don't pad it. Footnotes, cite sources for your information, like I said, right? In the humanities, the standard is Chicago. MLA, which they teach you in English 101 and 102, is pretty much exclusively English literature. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Now, I would rather that you use Chicago because I think it's better for the humanities. We'll talk more about why I think it's better for the humanities. But if that learning curve is too steep for you and it prevents you from getting the paper in on time, and if you're spending more time worrying about how to do Chicago-style footnotes than you are about the content of your paper, right? I would rather that you worked on the content of your paper and gave me MLA citations, right? But the world is full of people throwing instructions at you and saying you've got to do it this way. So there you are, right? Learn another thing you can learn from. Okay? Whatever you do, don't use Wikipedia-style footnotes. In Wikipedia, the footnote number goes to a reference. In other words, there's 5 footnotes, number 1. Right? That's a Wikipedia thing, right? There should be only 1 footnote, number 1, if you use the numbers. And your word processing program does it for you, right? And it even keeps the numbering sequential if you block and copy and move the last paragraph to the first, right? It'll just renumber everything, okay? Make sure you include illustrations of the works that you're discussing at the end of the essay. I prefer them after the text and before the works cited. Don't embed them in your essay. Is that spelled right? Is it embed or embed? It's embed if you're a journalist. That was in the New York Times crossword this morning. Embed, right? Okay. Embedded. Embed. I'm looking at it now. It looks wrong, right? But whatever you do, don't bed them M or M in your text, right? Make sure, though, that when you talk about an image, you reference it, right? So in your text, for example, Thomas would say, Van der Heyden's view of the, whatever they're calling it, right? Because it's pieces of all over Amsterdam into this one view. But in this picture, you should say figure 1, right? And then go down the figure 1, I can go look at it, right? And the paper matrix sort of talks about this in greater detail. Right? Make sure that you reference the image in the body of the text. And you've probably seen this done in scholarly articles that you've read, where it says see figure 1, right? Or figure 2 or figure 3. The figure number should be sequential as well. So the first, your intro ought to introduce your picture, right? In your introduction, there ought to be something about the picture that inspired this essay. So that means figure 1 is going to obviously be your picture, right? The one we started with. Figure 2 will be whatever one you come up with that you want to introduce next, right? Your second image that you see shouldn't be figure 13, right? They should follow the same sequence, right? I've seen some journals that don't care about that, but on the norm, they should. Okay. Make sure your illustrations have captions, that you pay attention to the artist title, the date, and the museum and the city where it's housed. If you can't find that, it's time to contact me, right? If you're looking around the web and you found a really great image that really makes sense and really helps you understand something about your picture better, about your theme, and you really need to use it, then it's time maybe to do a little bit more research. If you know the artist, then go find a book on them and see if you can figure out where it lives. And if you can't, then we can just say location unknown. Right? Yes?
I have one of the illustrations I used. It wasn't in a museum, but it was in a book.
Right. So what you should do, this is a very good question. So what Jesse asked, it was, what do you do if it's an illustration that's not in a museum so much as it's an illustration from a 17th century book? Right? And we've seen some of our people have talked about that insofar as ways of understanding things. And I've mentioned these books of emblem books, right, is a really good way to understand things, right? Okay, what are you going to do if you're going to use one of those? I would just put what book it came from, right?
What I did,
and I think that, yeah, and you're fine with that because unless it's a unique copy of that book, right? Now, I mean, you may have found it on a page. Give as much information as you can from where you found it. That's always a good rule of thumb, right? And if you can't, the other good rule of thumb is if you've got a question, you're not sure you're doing it right, who has 2 thumbs and will email you back? Wait, this way, who has 2 thumbs, speaks French, and will email you back? Moi, right? So email me and ask if there's ever any question on that. Okay. That's a very good question, right? Make sure your illustrations are big enough to see clearly and don't pixelate out on you. Jesse, I'm going to pick on you. Your illustration of the swan is blurry, right? There's better ones out there. Find one, okay? I'm just going to pick on you so I know you can take it, right? So make sure that they don't pixelate out on you when you make them big enough to see, right? You don't want to stretch it and have it go boxy on you, right?
I didn't want the file to be super large.
Well, I'll talk about that. I'll show you exactly how to make the file not super large as well. So one of the things is if there are various things, if you've got Photoshop, more power to you. If you don't have Photoshop, we have labs on campus that do. There are also free software where you can resize images. Right? Very easy to do most of what Photoshop does, not skewing and whatnot, but a lot of other stuff, cropping and all, resizing. There are free versions of this. I was trying to figure out how not to pay Photoshop $9.99 a month or $19.99 a month. $19.99 a month.
It's almost $30 with the student discount.
In fact, I'm getting $19.99 for the entire suite. That's what I'm paying. We should talk. I bet I could save you $10 a month, and you could buy me a 6-pack every month, and still come out $4 in the day. I didn't say that. They're listening to me. Right? It's the no, it's the Russians. The Russians are listening. Anyway, there are ways to resize the images, and in addition to that, even if you haven't, if it's just one of those big ass images from the Rijksmuseum, for example, then you can. There's ways to resize that as well. The other thing you do is do a screenshot, and that's much less DPI. If you do a screenshot, there's free screenshot.
Isn't it Word, if you hold down Shift and do the corner, that it will resize it without distorting?
That resizes it, but it doesn't resize it. That resizes the display, but it doesn't resize the size of the image. The image is still saved as big. We'll talk more about. Yeah, it is. It is. Trust me, that's what I do for a living. Okay, we'll talk about all these things as we move our way through. So, a works cited page. Okay, you need that at the end.
Why'd you look at me? I have one.
Because you're in my line of vision, man. I look at you and I'm looking at 3 other people behind you. Why do you assume it's you?
Because we made eye contact.
Why are you looking at me? I'm saying the same thing. Okay. Okay. Very good. So that checklist is all there. Okay. So as we're talking about the assignment, a couple things I want to mention before we go to that paper matrix that's up on Canvas. Solid research. Right, make sure that you're doing solid research. You got about 2 weeks, right? Make sure that you're doing some solid research. You should be working on the writing, and don't put off the writing until you're done. The more you can write as you're researching, this is my Achilles heel, right? The more you can write as you're researching, the more it can direct your research. As you start to write something, you say, I need to know more about that, right, before I can go on and talk more. So when I'm talking about solid research, published sources only. For the most part, no websites. Remember that JSTOR is not a website. JSTOR is an online database, right? Groves Art Online is not a website. It is an online database. There's a difference between that and websites, right? The one website that I think is totally acceptable, right, is the NGA's online edition. You know about this, right? That the newest version of the National Gallery of Art's catalog of its own 17th century Dutch art is now available online rather than printed. The old version from 95 is printed, and it's available as a download as well. So you got the old one and the new one, right? But the newest one is only 2 or 3 years old. Nice, newer research, right? And that's perfectly fine to use. Shell.
So, we should use any of the OERs that we had earlier this semester?
Email me about them on a case by case. Most of those are pretty generic, right? Those are sort of like using an introductory level textbook. And I think it's better to use, if there's information in there that you can't find anywhere else, then go ahead and use it.
Yeah, so like in my intro, I used one from the Still Life, just in article, and I put it in my intro because in the intro it's like broader.
Yeah. The OERs are sort of your last ditch attempt. It's like when you get a textbook for a class and it's kind of like the overview of everything. And the person who writes those things is not necessarily a very good specialist scholar in that particular field. And that's kind of the issue about the OERs versus, say, vetted scholarly sources, is one, we don't know if it's been peer reviewed. There's that problem. But the other problem is that there's the issue of authority, right? And in an era where, anybody with authority is being questioned right, left, and center, one of the things that we should always be concerned with is, do the people who we're getting our information from know what the hell they're talking about, right? Or do they have a basis, a platform from which to talk, right? And that would be why I would clue you to a book on Haida or an article that was published on Haida for those two reasons, right? Peer review and deeper authority, right? But if that's all you've got, there's a good chance that you probably don't even need to footnote it because it's probably so generic in its outlook that you may not need to. So what you can do with that is the same thing I was pointing at Jesse about doing, which is email me if you've got a specific thing. Say, hey, do you think I need to footnote this? Right? This is the only place I saw it, and we can talk about it on a case-by-case basis. Okay? Now, speaking of online sources, right? A lot of things are available through our library as PDFs, as ebooks. A lot of things are available even through an architecture source as electronic versions. If it looks like you have used only an electronic version and have ignored every printed source that I said to go find, it's going to say to me one thing. Lazy, right? Get into the library and get it. Don't just rely on the things that are convenient and easy to get, right? What you need to do is you need to get out there and get your hands on some of these things. Because while in 10 years, by the time I'm getting ready to retire, right, there's a good chance that the majority of things will be available as PDFs, right? But right now, it's maybe 15%, right, of the good stuff. So,
The art section is on the quiet floor.
Yeah.
Right when you walk in on the right.
Yeah, it's all ends. All the art's end. That's the nice thing, right? You learn the LOC system, right? I did this as an undergrad, so I figured out where things. N is art, right? And A is, I think, drawing, and B is sculpture, and then C anyway. Well, it is. There's a system, and it makes sense because then you know where to go browse, right? Which is kind of cool. At a certain point, you can just go say, "Oh, I found a book on landscape," and if I go that part of the library, I'm going to find a bunch more books on landscape because they're all in the same place, you know, right? And Dutch landscapes will be one section, and French landscapes will be another one, right? So it's and it's, you know, this is why they call it library science, right? That's why they have library science degrees, is that they learned this stuff, these classification systems, right? Very helpful. I mean, I spent way too much time in the library. No, I wouldn't say that. I spent a lot of time in the library when I was an undergrad and a graduate student. Because you had to back then, right? You couldn't get it off your computer back in the 70s and 80s. Okay? So there we are with this. Good. So, okay, wait. And, published sources, no websites. Don't rely too heavily on e-sources. I understand that some of you might get to the point where everything you need is actually electronically available. But if I look at your list of resources and I see that there was something I'd suggested to you that was printed and you just didn't do it because it looks like you were too lazy to get it, that's not going to help your overall grade. Right? Primary sources or focused scholarly secondary sources. That's what you should be looking for, right? Some of you might actually be using primary sources. Certainly your pictures are primary sources, right? But you might be looking at an anthology of Dutch literature from the time period. Thomas might be looking at somebody that wrote about Dutch city planning in the 17th century, primary source, right? Probably not, but you might, right? Madeline might be reading a poem set in a Dutch house to figure out how the house was laid out. Who knows, right? So if you have primary sources, that's great. More power to you. Secondary sources ought to be focused and scholarly. And that means as you're doing research, try to avoid things like newspaper articles, Newsweek, right? CNN.com, right? You're looking for people who know what they're talking about, who have spent an amount of time researching what you're interested in, right? Try to avoid generic surveys. Gardner's Art Through the Ages, Jansen's History of Art. And the reason for this is those people have gone out and they have distilled what the experts have said and put them into a narrative that's supposed to guide you from the caves to computers in one semester, right? So that's not really a good place. It's a great place to figure out which way is up, right? To get your lungs full of air before you deep dive. But they're not the final source you should be looking at for things, right? One of the recommendations that I make to students all the time as you're doing research is you always look at footnotes. Always look at bibliographies. Because if you pick up a book on Vermeer, right? And there might be a study out there that is, the little street in Delft and the activities depicted in the household. And that's what I've been looking for. and you didn't come across any other way because it's in, the history of Windows or something like that, right? In some book that you wouldn't even have thought of looking for. There it is, it's waiting for you, and they found it, and you can then go find that and find out everything you're looking for when they only want it for one little sentence, right? You want it for something more. So always look at footnotes, always look at bibliographies. That's one of the reasons we recommend Chicago-style footnotes. That's a whole lot easier to do if they're Chicago-style. Just go read through the footnotes. Is there a title I'm looking for? Whereas Johnson 33, right? Jones 44, then, right? It makes it much easier to sort of go through these things. Okay? Be sure as you're doing your research that you take notes while you're reading. And you probably do anyway, but make sure that you get the complete bibliography information that you'll need to cite the source in your paper. Right? So as you're taking notes, I do this still, right? As I'm writing my notes for essays I might write, the first thing I do is I get the book and I type at the top of my notes, or I handwrite it if I've got it on paper. The stuff I know I'm going to need to cite that source, right? So you want to write this down, what you're going to need, right? For books, you need the author, right? If there's an editor and a translator, you need that. You need the full title of the book, including anything after the colon, right? Or after a period or a subtitle of that book. You need the whole title of the book. You need the publishing information, the city and the date, right? Now, don't count on the MU library to get it right. When you get it, look at the title page. Make sure. Because what you're counting on is some underpaid student employee, right, to get it right in the MU catalog. And it may have been checked, it may not have been checked. I see typos there all the time, right? If it's an essay in an anthology, if you've got a book, Studies of Dutch Genre Painting, right, Masters of Landscape, and there are different essays by different authors, then you've got to have the author of the essay, the translator of that essay if they've got it. You need the starting and the ending page of the essay in the book. Starts on 31, ends on 45. Right? Plus all the book information. If it's an essay in the journal, again, you need the author, the title of the essay, the start and end pages of the essay. You need the title of the journal, you need the volume number, and you need the date. If you don't write this stuff down, I'm saying this because I'm looking at Thomas because he's right in the middle of everything, right? I'm not looking at you because you did anything wrong, right? And you've had me before, no. When I feel like an old man. When I was sitting where you were, we had to walk 20 miles in the snow. Get to school. They didn't have school. They didn't have roofs. We sat in the woods. Right? No. I my first art history term paper, I had all these notes, and I'd written them down, and I didn't write down what page they came from. And I had to go back and check the book out again, right? I'd go to the municipal library and get the book back out again, right? And do it a second time. If you don't do it right the first time, you're just going to double the amount of time it takes to do it right. So that's why I'm saying this, right? Do it right the first time. Save yourself hours, right? Or a bad grade for doing it wrong, right? Okay. All right. One other thing about bibliographies, research, and so forth. For me, for my classes, under works cited, don't list the paintings. I know that some other people are telling you to do that, and they may be right, and that's what they want. But with any term paper you write in any class, ask the professor what they want. Do you have any particular rules, right? Because I'm telling you what I want from mine. And on your bibliography, on your works cited page, that should just be the scholarly or primary sources that you use, but not images, because those appear in the illustrations. Right? I have all the information I need for those in the illustration, if you've done the illustration properly. Okay? So make sure you don't list paintings under that. One last thing insofar as the works cited is concerned, one of the things our library does that drives me nuts, and I think it's the consortium, it's not just our library, is they list the artist as one of the authors of the book. So if you go to the library website and it'll say Arthur Wheelock and Jan Vermeer, right? It's like, no, he had not, and it was written in 1995. No, Vermeer was dead, right? For 300 years. He's not writing anything in 1995. And the reason they do it is that there are works of art in the book by Vermeer, so they list him as the illustrator, if you will, right? But if you've got a reference to a book and one of the authors is listed as the artist, cut it, right? Don't list it in your bibliography because they're not writing it. Snip it out of there. Margaret's the cutting queen because she's been deep in getting. Hey, by the way, 2 things. Be sure you go to the show and see Margaret's designs. This is her senior year, and she's in the Portfolio Motion show next weekend, right? Thursday, Friday, Saturday next week. So after our class, we can all go. We can all go there as a group after class on Friday. Are you worried about is the booze? Is that what you're saying? Do they card?
On the Marymount website, there's a tab, like a link for pen that you can get your tickets online. They also sell them like every day.
Outside the gym, right?
Yeah.
Right outside the gym. So I need to go get. Yeah. But go, it's fun. I went for the first time last year. It's really fun.
It is a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun.
What? I think for students,
It's
yeah, 15, but I'm not.
It might even be cheaper. It might be 10.
Oh, really?
I think so. I forget. But anyway, it's not too expensive.
No. The one on Thursdays more
It's
expensive.
yeah, it's $50, but it's catered and there's an open bar. Yeah.
It's open bar.
Open bar.
$15. I can go through $50 pretty quickly. $50 for open bar.
But
No, I'm not gonna.
it's
Which day are you going?
I don't know. I talked to my wife as what day is best. Probably Friday.
Alright, Friday it is.
We also want to find out when Holly and Adam are going to go because we go hang out with our friends. We have friends. Holly Karpetkova, English teacher. She's the second best young lady. Remember where you are. She's the second best. Anyway, the other thing, Shelley got second place in the entire university for her poster presentation Wednesday in the Student Research Conference. Bravo. Excellent. And one of our art students got third place in presentations, period. Grant.
really?
Grant got third place. Rocked it. Right? I don't know. I didn't know them. It was a tie for third.
Eric Maloney.
This
Man, I swear, it's rigged. It's rigged.
It is rigged.
You know
You're
his dad is Upen.
They're all rigged. Okay.
Did you know his dad's Upen?
Oh! Well, there you are. Well, Upen's not judging, though.
Yeah, I know.
Upen's a very fair fellow.
Eric's
I like
brilliant.
Upen a lot.
This man's brilliant.
Okay, now where's my thingy? Style show.
All the grades.
Oh, sorry about that. Whoa! That wasn't you guys though. That was a different class. That was my intro class. Woo! Oh man, that was bad. FERPA, thematic essay.
You still have the works cited like guidelines.
Yes, they're up here. They're on this page.
Date.
Okay.
I just want to make sure this
Right. We're gonna do a little. I want to go over these. So this is a Word document, right? The extended essay instructions and template, which means that you can open it and you can just replace my text with yours, right? Make that a little bit smaller so we see more of it on the screen. Whoa! Hang on a second.
Whoa.
What's going on here? Why is that doing that? What's going on? My computer's gone crazy.
That's huge.
That's way too. Arr! I tell you, the touch screen does weird things sometimes. I think I need to go to view. Yeah, there we are. Can you guys see that okay? All right. Okay, so the title page, right, is here for you. You give me the title of your essay there. If you want to, Margaret dolled her up with some flourish. That's great. It doesn't count down, but it will not make the paper grade better.
No, gotta know that.
If you give me a cover sheet with an illustration of your work on it, make sure that when you refer to it in the body of your text, you say, cover sheet, so I know where it was, right? Okay. Lower right corner, information, your name, name of the class, me, and the date you're turning it in, right? Cover sheet stuff there. The nice thing, this is formatted so that all of the left margins indent automatically at 0.5, which you want. It's flush left like you want. It has no extra line break between the paragraphs, which you want if you use this template, right? No, because you just laughed because other people were doing it, not you, right? So you can use these instructions as a template for your, just get rid of mine and put in yours. No, because you laughed when I had that up there. I know people who do this. Well,
No, if it's...
That wasn't...
Never mind.
I wasn't going to
Mario was saying something. It's fine.
Would you care to share it with everybody?
We can share with the kids.
We can share with... I hope you brought enough for everybody. Right. This is all the formatting you need, right? Explanation for some of the complicated bits. Be sure you've got a solid introduction. I mean, this is absolutely crucial. Your introduction should establish your work of art and the questions you're asking and where you're headed. Something about the method you're going to use. So I'm going to pick on Margaret. Margaret is working on a Vermeer picture as well. I'm looking at another Vermeer picture, right? As we know, it was the love letter, right? Which turned out to be missing the day that we were there, right? Gone off to Tokyo. Okay, so her introduction ought to say, 1669, Vermeer painted this picture where we see blah, 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 blah. Maid handing an interior, maid handing a letter to a mistress who seemed surprised. Get me engaged with it, right? Figure 1, right? If we look at other Vermeers, or, I'm interested in the costume and these two figures. And what I'll be doing is looking at, you'll say it a better way than this, because I'm off the cuff, right? The costumes of the two figures establish their class differences. I will be looking at other pictures to try to figure out sort of what we know as to whether or not the kinds of costumes we're seeing here are realistic for the scene or not. Okay? Right? So I'll be looking at other pictures. I'll be doing research into the history of costume to establish that. There's your introduction. You've established your focus, which is that picture, right? And a direction you're heading, which is what I'm going to talk about that picture, which is the use of costuming. Jorge.
So the usage of I and we in the introduction and conclusion would be kind of acceptable?
I have no problems with it. I know other people do. I have no problems with the first person. At the same time, you can say this paper will, if you'd rather, right? If you want to be more, sterile about it, right? But no, you're writing it. You're a you. I would recommend that you would not use the royal we. And insofar as writing about the picture itself, so I talked about Margaret maybe describing the picture a bit, try not to sound like a tour guide. If you look on the left, you will find a window, And if you look on the right, don't write like you're on a bus, and telling people what, or the canal tour, right? Over on your left, you'll see this. Try not to write that way, right? If you use the first person. And I think the royal we sucks, right? Mightily. It's really just a horrible sounding thing. So don't use the royal we either, okay? Solid introduction, the focus and the direction. It should have a fairly clearly articulated thesis statement. These are things that often are missing, right, from introductions. It should be the last thing you write, because it should be based on what the paper is trying to do, right? And research leads you directions. The writing of the paper might lead you places you don't know. You won't know sort of how it's all holding together until you've got it all held together, and then write the introduction. Okay? One of the harder things to write, if you do it too early, I find conclusions harder to write than that, right? Okay? Body of the essay, provide evidence to support your claims. Be sure you do that. That's another common pitfall, is that people make claims and they don't give me evidence for it, right? This means that. Okay, why? Right? I'm not picking on you. These houses, I know with your picture, right? These houses come from the Herrengracht. Okay, how do we know that? What's the evidence? because they can be seen in another picture that is more topographically accurate, or it's still there, right? That it's identifiable in a different location, right? So don't make claims without providing evidence. That's a common problem. Yes?
Do you want us to logic it out or say our source or
If it's
I know this because of this?
there's no pat answer for that. There's no pat answer for that, Maeve. I think you should logic it out, but you don't need to logic it out over the course of 3 pages, right? Does that make sense? Okay. It's a case-by-case issue. So what you could do, anybody in the room, but since I'll say to Maeve because she's the one who brought it up, what you could do, what is that thing doing? Is that taking pictures? You're recording me.
No.
Good. I'm recording me. You're the Russian spy. You got my curse word. So does Jesus. He's here. Okay, so just so you know, there's a higher authority than your little microphone. You can always email me and say, "Here, I've got this section right here," and put it on a page for me. And say, "Do you think I need to reason it out further?" And I'd be happy to weigh in on that. If it's 11 o'clock the night before it's due, I won't be happy to weigh in on it. But if it's, next week sometime, that's great. I think it's always good if the author has presented a bunch of evidence to at least give a brief overview of what it's all about, right? So you could say, for example, by looking at a number of poems by various Dutch authors like X and Y, so-and-so has reached the conclusion that this, right? But you don't have to give me a verbatim narrative of how they got there. Yes, we're still talking, so you have to raise your hand.
Is it cool if I name drop, or do you want me to be like, this person from this place, who's important because of this?
I'll tell you what's really cool is if you drop a 50. It's right here. No, so name dropping is good. If you're citing a source that's a known authority in the field, then it's very good to sort of cite that, yes, as
Or if it's like an obscure person who's going to have your journal?
fine, do it.
Do I need to say, this person, blah, blah, blah?
There again, there's no pat answer for that. I don't mind either way, right? If it seems to be that there's only one person that's ever said something about something, so Sydney is working on De Hoek, right? I would think name dropping Sutton would be key because he's like the only one out there that's really done some really thorough work on De Hoek, right? Because that's the one that's out there. If Jorge were somehow to find a writing by Art Vanderneer who talked about I like dogs, then you would want to name drop him, right? It doesn't hurt and it doesn't necessarily always help either, right? There's not a single pat answer for that. Okay. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of this, right? But you can read this whole thing, and it goes over sort of all of these questions that we have about this, right? Citations. So, this is kind of where we are, right? Whenever you use another scholar's ideas or research, whether it's a direct quote or a paraphrase of ideas in your own words, you need a citation. Okay? Whenever you are resting your conclusions on the work of somebody else, you need a citation. Right? You do not need to footnote any widely held factual data, right? Chicago style is footnotes, bottom of each page. It is so easy in all of your word processing to do this, right? You just go, it's probably similar in Macs. By the way, Word's free for Mac as well, right? Bill Gates has given the first taste for free to everybody, right? Knowing that then you'll use it for the rest of your life and you'll have to pay for it at one point, right? But you click on references, put the cursor where you want your footnote. The footnote should always come after the punctuation. What happened there? You know what it is? It's not my hard drive's getting really full. Then you hit references and you hit insert footnote. And it's just that easy. It takes you right to it. Right? And there you are, right? Then you type in the footnote and you go back, click on the footnote number, and it takes you right back up to the top, and it automatically sequentially numbers it for you. Couldn't be easier, really. Okay? But again, if that drives you nuts, it won't bother me if you use MLA. Now, about citations, right? The different styles of citations are there for a reason. It may seem that they're just there to make your life as a student hard, but they're there for a reason, right? APA puts the date right after the name of the author, right? The American Psychological Association. That's what APA stands for, right? Right after the author. And the reason for that is timeliness matters, right? Recent studies trump older studies. So if it says 2017, that is better than if it says 1954, right? And that's true that's why the sciences use it, right? It's because you don't want to quote somebody who says man will never land on the moon, something like that, right? Because in a study from 1953. Right? However, the humanities have a far longer shelf life, and that means that the dates don't matter as much to us. And this is why we put them toward the end, right? So APA really is more about timeliness, and that's why they use the format that they do. The humanities, both MLA and Chicago, rely on past statements much more regularly, and this is why we don't care about putting the date up front, right? Because we're relying on primary and secondary sources that are often old, okay? Now, MLA, in-text citations. The reason the Modern Language Association, English Literature, uses this is because the vast majority of their sources are selections from literature that they are using as the basis for their study. And that way you put Shakespeare, Macbeth, Scene 1, Act 3, line 24. This is right back to the source of what they're doing, right? It works for that, right? Emily Dickinson, I can't name any of these, right? It sources us back, and it works for them. It works really well for them. The rest of the humanities, however, are often using 2 or 3 sources to prove a point. Right? They're bringing things together that help us to say, okay, and I got this source over here. And if you put that in a parenthetical, then all of a sudden you got a 3-line parenthetical because you've got 3 sources that led to that conclusion. And that means your reader loses the argument because we got to jump past that stupid parenthetical comment. So this is why Chicago is used by so many others, because you can make a single footnote to 3 different sources that you amalgamated, right? You brought together to prove a particular point, right? So there's reasons for these different things, right? And there's a reason why Chicago really is better for the humanities, I think, than MLA is, right? And it's not just because I'm used to it, right? Okay. The other thing I mentioned before, the reader can read. The whole point of footnotes is not for you, it's for your reader, right? That's the point of the footnotes. They're there for your reader. They're citing the evidence that you use, and they're leaving a paper trail. They're leaving crumbs, right? String to get out of the labyrinth. Use your metaphor, right? And they're there to provide your reader a service of where they can find out more about what you learned. And so footnotes are easier to sort of go through. What do they use? Do they have a source here that I haven't read before that I really want to get my hands on right away while I'm reading this and get that ball rolling, right? Or maybe just go there instead. That's why that's very helpful. Okay. Direct quotes. 2 things. One is 9 times out of 10 you probably don't have to use them. You should use paraphrase, right? And yes, you can name drop in that, right? Even as so and so suggested, this means this. Right? Short direct quotes should be in the body of the text. By short, I mean up to 3 lines or so. Right? But make sure that you shift from your voice to that author's voice through your words. Don't just plop it in there. So in this case, an example at the bottom of this page. Here's an example. In his instructions, Trowbridge says, hey, I name dropped myself. Trowbridge says that, quote, short direct quote should be in the body of the text. Right? I've shifted from the voice, this anonymous voice of this, to the person I'm quoting from. Right? Make sure that you do that. Always put the footnote reference outside the close quote. Right? If you've got a longer direct quote, they need to be single-spaced and indented from the left. Right? Not double-spaced still. Single-spaced and indented from the left. So if you had a longer section of something, that's how you would handle that. Okay? These little things will not be the difference between an A and a D, right? But they're important things to pay attention to. Include illustrations. We'll look at those at the end. Any work of art that you discuss at length. Clearly identify the work you're discussing. Many of you will have multiple works that are very similar. Figures in a courtyard, right? Letter writers. So make sure, okay, so in the London letter writer, right? In the National Gallery in the Washington courtyard, right? Make sure that you make it clear which one you're talking about, right? If you've got multiples. Thomas is going to hit this hard, right? Cityscape, view of the Herrengracht, right? So try to make it clear to your reader what paintings you're talking about. Maeve.
So I started off my research project with I delved further into talking about courting rituals at the time. I was able to understand a lot of other conversations actually. So like the courtyard ones.
So why don't you and I sit down and talk about where we're going to go next with this paper? Maybe the paper goes in a different direction than you started with. Yeah, but let's sit down next week, early Monday, right? Make an appointment with me. Sit down and talk about where you're headed next and how to handle that, right? And then that's just you and me. Yeah, that's great. So that means all my comments back to you might not matter anymore because you're doing something that you didn't let me know you were doing, right? Yeah, that's cool. Okay, great. So identify the works, right? Works cited page we know about, right? Conclusion that ends it all. Okay, now illustrations. Roughly 1,000 pixels in the big dimension is a good size if you can resize things, and I'll show you something in just a second. But it's important with your captions. This is why it's important with your captions. You may have two works by the same artist with the same title. So it's important that you give me the artist's name, the title, the approximate date as given, most places, and the place where it's located. For my purposes, for this class, I don't care where you got the image. I don't care if you downloaded it off of one of my PowerPoints or if you got it off of the website from the museum or whatever. I don't care where you got it, right? Some other people do, but I don't. The digital rights of this, you're not going to publish it, so it doesn't matter, right? As you're trying to make the images big, Margaret was mentioning, if you click on the image, I don't know how well you can see those. These little gray dots in the corner, here, halfway across here on the side. If you grab it from the corner, it will maintain its proportions. That is absolutely crucial because this is primary evidence. You don't want to alter it, right? So you don't want to do this, right? And make them all goofy, right? Oops. There. You want to drag from the corner because that maintains the proportions, right? Now, Margaret, when you do this, right, though that didn't work, right? When you make it really small, it's actually not making it smaller. It's keeping all of the digital data there. It's fitting it into a smaller window. So what you need to do to make it smaller is either resize it before you use it, right? Or double click on the image. And there's a command up here called compress pictures, right? This is what you can do. Jesse, right? Click on compress pictures, and what you want to do right now, it's at 200 dpi. If you click on web screen, it drops it by half, which means it really drops it by a fourth. It's half both ways, right? And you do all pictures in document. So, Madeline, your thing came through at about 25 gigabytes or megabytes, right? It was big. It was almost at the limit of what Google would send. I did this, and it went down to 400, right? 400 bytes, that's it. I mean, it shrunk it that much, right? So this is a great little trick to have, okay? The other thing that it will do usually is it will delete the cropped areas. So if you've cropped it, it'll get rid of the cropped stuff. See, it saves all that stuff for you. So that really does make a huge difference in doing this. So double click on the image, compress pictures, and play with that pop-up window. And again, I'm recording this so you can play it back, right? If you need to look at this again, right? So that's a very nice thing to do. And it doesn't look any different when you do it. However, if you've done that and then you try to stretch it later, you'll get your goofy pixelated picture, right? I usually work with 200 DPI because then I can resize up a bit if I need to without losing a lot of resolution because print usually prints at 72 or 96 DPI. Okay? And that's true with PowerPoints as well. Okay? So there are images there. And 2 per page is usually pretty good, either top or bottom or side to side. Put 5 on a page, they're usually too small to see. Right? Put 1 on a page, they're usually too big. Right? 2 on a page is nice. It works just fine. Okay? The last thing for the last 10 minutes, citations. Okay? How do you format footnotes? Now, somebody asked, is that Chicago-style guideline still up here? And it is. So you have access to this lengthy document that talks about how to format just about every kind of book you might find. Let's see. Okay. Let's do it this way. By type. And the first 4 pages or so are how to format for the bibliography. And the second 4 pages or so is how to format for footnotes. Right? Freezing up on me. Right? For footnotes. Come on. Behave. For some reason it's not doing it.
The citations just want to run away.
Yeah, that's right. They don't want you to do it either. Just like the rest of it. There we are. Right, here's footnotes. Okay. So what I did was I'm going to bring the lights back up again. Here. Let's see, just straight back that way. Some things to practice with. Right? And you have to practice. Here, let's just do more than 2 lights. It's more than enough to go around, right? So what I've got for each of these is I picked up 6 different kinds of citations that you're most likely to come across. Right? These are things I think that these ones you'll see more than anything else. A book with one author, a book from a series, a book review on the first page. On the second page, a essay in a journal, an essay in an anthology, and an author quoted in a secondary source. Right? So, especially you, right? An author quoted somewhere else. Because if you're looking at Dutch literature at the time, chances are you're reading somebody else's translation. So these are how you do it, right? And underneath, and each of these you can find on this as well. So going through it, how do we do it? So let's look at the first one. I was going to have us do this full book, but we only got 7 minutes left. Right? Wolfgang Stackhaus, Dutch landscape painting in the 17th century. Right? In a bibliography, each kind of information, the author, the book title, the publisher, is handled as a different set of information offset by a period. Right? So it would be Steckow, Wolfgang, period. Dutch landscape painting of the 17th century, period. Ithaca, New York, Cornell University Press, 1981. But the footnote, because it's part of the text, reads like a sentence. The only periods you would see in any part of it would be for abbreviation. Ed or trans, right? But not otherwise. So there are no breaks in it, and because it's a sentence, we also leave the author's name first last. Right? So take a second and do Steckow. Just use the format. You've got all the data there that you need. Write it out. No, his first name is Wolfgang. Isn't that a great first name? I'm gonna change my name to Wolfgang. You can call me Wolf. And by the way, the number in parentheses, that's just I made that up. Use that number as if it were the page number. See that at the top? Just pretend 34 is the page number that you're citing.
Isn't there a period after title four?
No.
No?
Look, not in Chicago. There is in the bibliography though, the works cited, right, but not in the footnotes. Okay. In the works cited, every part of every portion of data is offset by a period.
Yeah.
So it's a period after the author's name, right? But in the citations, in the footnotes, there isn't. Right? And since you're an English major, you've probably only ever seen these in-text things rather than the bottom of the page footnotes. Did everyone know what that one? Pretty straightforward, right? Wolfgang Stackow, comma, Dutch landscape painting of the 17th century, no comma, right? Ithaca, New York, Cornell University Press, colon, 1981, in parentheses, comma, page number, right, 34. Now, in this case, you would want to make sure, if there's any kind of confusion, that you clear it up. Ithaca is an Ithaca in Greece, right? So you would definitely say Ithaca, New York, even though Cornell should tip us off, right? That's what Cornell is.
So should we always put this state?
You don't always New York, right? I mean, really, right? Toronto. It's not like you really there's another Toronto out there where they're publishing books, right? However, Cambridge, right? UK versus Massachusetts, it's a big, and there are big universities in both of them.
So should we in this one?
I would put New York, you wouldn't get grounded graded now, but this is a good rule of thumb. If there's any possible confusion, or if it's a lesser known town, right? Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey is a big publishing town, but I mean, who goes to Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, right? No, The Sopranos, right? Yeah, exactly. You never heard of it. You do if you do lot 5 bibliography, right? You hear about Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey. So there we go. Let's look at second page. Let's look at a book and a journal. Let's do Leiflon, Haugen Leiflon at the top. Yes, put NKJ, or even abbreviate the time. You don't have to write it all out. I'm not going to break this. This is practice. So, yeah, Dutch landscape urban view. It's plenty.
There's also a button that you can click after the dog, so just add the perfect citation.
Yes, I think there is. There are machines out there that will auto format it for you, but they're only as good as the data you put in. I've seen things come up as citing the author Ibid, which is Ibidem, as before. I'd just be careful with that. You know that, and also practice makes perfect, right? If you're learning how to do things, it would be easier the second time. Okay, so we're almost out of time, so let's go ahead and look at this. A couple things I want to point to. So it'd be Haugen Leiflon, comma, and then in quotes, the Dutch landscape, the urban view, Haarlem and its environs, blah, 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 blah. Right? Comma, close quote. Then Nederlands Kunsthistorische Jaarboek. You don't need the word volume, just the number 48. Okay? Don't need vol or volume or any of that, just 48. Now, if there was an issue number, if it was 48 issue 4, you put 48 comma number 4, NO period 4, right? But if there isn't one, don't bother, right? let me finish it out and then we'll answer questions, right? Next comes the date in parentheses. In this case, we just have the year. However, if it's got a number 4, that usually means it's got more, right? December or fall, right? Number 3 would be summer, okay? So if it gives you more, list more. But don't necessarily, you don't have to have it, right? So in this case, 1997 is all you have, so go for it. That's what you need, right? Now you'll notice that unlike a book, after the close quote, there's a colon. Don't ask me why. I have no idea, right? But before the page number in journal articles only, there's a colon, right? If it's a book, if it's an essay in an anthology, there's another comma. Okay? Now, maybe I'll get you have a quick question. I have one last thing to say before we quit. So go ahead, your question first.
University can be abbreviated yes.
Sorry?
University can be abbreviated and for the page number you say just a number or
Just a number.
dot.
Yeah, just a number. And yes, University Press, there's a couple things you can do. University Press, you can actually even further abbreviate just U period P period. Up, right? Cambridge University Press would be Cambridge U period P period. That's fine. Okay? Yeah. So last thing. Who cares about citations? I don't even care that much. But I mean, no, but seriously, in the real world and what you're learning to do in college, who gives a flying rip about whether or not you got your citation, right? What are you going to leave this class learning? I would rather that you left this class learning the stuff that we learned sitting in front of paintings than any of this, right? But there is a skill that you're developing because life throws you stuff that you've got to do in a particular way. Think about your taxes. Why do you hire somebody to do it, right? Because you've got to do it in a particular way. I try to do my own every year, and every year they send it back. You know, I'm sorry, but you're not getting that much money back, right? Because you didn't calculate this line properly. But that's what the world is full of people that do this. And when you leave this place and you try to get a job, you're going to have to fulfill things. Maybe you're going to try and get a grant to do some interesting work somewhere. There are very particular guidelines that you have to follow to the letter. And if you don't they don't even look at you, right? They're just trying to figure out how to get that stack of 500 applications down to something they can get through in a couple of weeks. And if you haven't done it right, you're over here. And you don't even get a letter, right? Sorry, no. So what you're developing when you're doing this is the ability to be given an unwieldy amount of boxes to check, right? And you got to do it, right? And it's not going to kill an A grade. It's not going to make an A grade into a C if you don't do your footnotes right. But if you do spend some time doing this, you actually are developing, if you think about it, you're developing a skill which is how to follow directions well, because you're not as free as you think you are. There are directions we've got to follow in life, right? And taking your driving exam, right? And you got to do things right, man. You got to read that thing, you got to understand it, you got to know what happens, what that yellow triangle sign means. Yeah.
Sorry, unrelated. What are you having a party still for final?
Yes.
Potluck.
So do you not, like the
IP freedom?
But I don't know if the letters are, but in the references, like if you're using
Oh.
the same.
No, I don't mind that at all. Okay, so the question is, I'm sorry we're a little bit over time, but here's the thing. What Shelley asked about was when you've got the second footnote to the same person, you find this in some scholarly articles, sometimes it will say IBID, I-B-I-D, which means the same author as the last one, right? And if it's the same author in the same book, you just see IBID. So one of them would say, Steckow 34. And the next footnote was to Steckow page 112. It could say IBID 112. But if the next footnote was to IBID to Steckow 34, it would just say IBID. Period, right? I'm fine with that, but here's a word of warning. Last thing you ever do. because if you block and copy the text and move it, then all of a sudden your IBID is wrong. You see what I'm saying? Right? So what I usually do when I'm submitting essays for publication is I use abbreviated footnotes for everything. It would say Steckow Landscape 34. And then what I would do once I've done block and copying everything is I'd go back and find the first reference to it and change that to the full reference. Right? And do that at the very end because now I know I'm not going to move that paragraph to page 5. Right? And so I would just beware using IBID early because all of a sudden then you'll say, that book doesn't have that page in it. Right? That source doesn't have that page. So those are fine to use. One last thing about citations, if you've got a paragraph and you've got 5 citations to Steckow 34, you could probably get away with one at the end of the paragraph. If everything in the paragraph is going to the same page of the same source, right? You don't need to bop all over to it, right? That way. And you don't need to say figure 1 every time you mention your painting, right? As long as it's clear enough that that's the one we're still talking about. Okay? Sorry for keeping you late. Hope this helps. See you guys on Tuesday. We'll talk more about art and we'll talk about the finals week potluck thing then as well. I'm going to do that as soon as I stop recording.